All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Nutanix at 9, or for those of you that are new, welcome to Nutanix at 9. Looking forward to digging into what may seem like a simple question today, but actually got a few different areas to explore on the concept. As always, we'll kind of kick this off with an agenda set, tell you what we're going to do today, and then kind of jump right into it. So thanks again to those of you that are here, and I know that as we encourage on all of our sessions, if you have questions, if you want to throw anything in the chat, we'll definitely be trying to encourage that throughout today. So let's go ahead and kind of talk about what we plan to go through today. So for those of you, again, that have been here, this is nothing new, but we'll just kind of walk through quick introductions of myself, of Mike Dent here, who you'll hear in a moment, as well as Egroup, for those of you that don't know Egroup. We'll talk a little bit typically about what's new, not so much this week. As far as updates go, we've covered quite a bit over the last few sessions, so we've actually just got something that might be new in terms of a tool that you can use with regards to what's new with Nutanix. And then we've got a few questions around the hardware software question, right? Like, is Nutanix hardware or software? How is it designed? How does it work? That kind of stuff. So we've got a few questions there, and then we'll kind of take anything based off of that. But as well, if you have questions, we do want to hear those also. So we'll dig into that. That'll probably be the majority of today's conversation, just kind of the Q&A portion. And then at the end here, if you are looking for assistance with Nutanix, if you want to see how we take what we talk about and apply it to the day-to-day business, we'll have a bit of an outro here with just some more details on how Egroup can help and how you can get in touch with who you need to get in touch with. So with that being said, let's kind of get into the introductions here. The voice that you hear, the person you see on screen, I'm Dan. I am an account executive here at Egroup. I cover kind of like the DC, Virginia area. So if you really enjoy the presentation today, you like what you're hearing from me, and you maybe are based in another state, just tell Egroup that you're in Virginia, and they'll send you my way. We'll deal with the trouble later. Didn't hear me say that, right, Mike?
But I didn't hear anything. Secret safe.
But the brains of the operation here, Mike Dent, he is our director of data center infrastructure. And actually, Mike, you've got kind of a Nutanix related event coming up later today. What you mind telling us a little bit about, what you're tackling today?
Yeah, so I'm sitting through the the Nutanix Certified Sales Expert, following in your footsteps. So looking forward to this. So I'll be doing that defense this afternoon, really going through some use cases and kind of customer scenarios around Nutanix, why Nutanix, and then trying to defend why I think Nutanix is a good solution for them. So I'm looking forward to it. Trying to put my sales hat on today rather than just the technical hat. So we'll see how this one shakes out for me.
Yeah, no, that's exciting stuff. It's for anybody with questions on that. Mike's taking he's taking the highest sales certification available from Nutanix. So we've got two of those already at Egroup. Mike will be the third. Assuming you get it right, Mike. And
true.
Well,
thanks.
I don't want to jinx you, right? We've all been watching the Olympics, but. Yeah, it's as far as certifications go, I guess my point is if you have questions on just getting certified, Mike, you're a great resource for that as well. So feel free to throw those kind of questions into the chat also.
Yeah, with Nutanix, I mean, they provide a great amount. I know this is kind of going off our topic for today, but it's a fun topic to talk about. Is everybody loves certifications. They've got a great number of sales certifications, sales engineer certifications, consulting certifications, and kind of what they call the NCP line, which is the Nutanix Certified Professional, which is going to be more akin to your traditional tech certifications, and it runs each of their products. So they've got a great kind of portfolio of certs. It's not just, hey, get this cert that covers 25 different subjects. They're pretty narrowed in and focused on what their certs are. I love that.
Yeah, no, it's a great enablement path for new customers, for myself, sellers, for anybody really interested in learning about it, right? And you can even spin up their home lab. But yeah, no, Mike, appreciate the background and best of luck on the exam later today.
Thanks.
For those of you that are new to Egroup, just kind of a quick bullet list of the things to take away from our time today. We've been around for about 20 years, so have seen some peaks and valleys, right, in terms of kind of how IT has been viewed in the business world. We've seen the peaks and valleys in the business world and kind of easily navigated those with some sound practices that we've built in-house and that we help our customers take on. We've been delivering those outcomes, like I said, for about 2 decades. Egroup is a bit unique. We're a privately owned, debt-free organization, so it gives us kind of that ability to drive our portfolio and make the decisions that we feel are best for the customer in terms of the portfolio that we've built here. And because of that mentality, we've been able to really drive a national business out of our headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. You know, it's a lot of power to the punch, if you will, in terms of what Egroup can provide. So if you have any questions kind of about the broader practice, we'll certainly take those. Obviously, we want to stay Nutanix focused today, but technologies focused on backup and disaster recovery, public cloud, Microsoft, you know, we kind of tie all those together. And Nutanix is a core concept as part of how we build out roadmaps and how we help customers optimize their infrastructure. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end here, but that's kind of it on Egroup. So as always, feel free to throw questions in there, but that's quick high level for those of you that haven't heard of us. Today, typically, we're talking about updates. I think last week, or excuse me, 2 weeks ago, last session, we talked a little bit about Mine and Era having some updates. But in terms of Nutanix news, nothing really groundbreaking today, Mike, unless there was something breaking overnight. But I did want to give a shout out to Jake, who is an employee of Nutanix, and he put together this tool here, and it's timeline.ntnx, nutanix.to. This is actually a great resource to bookmark if you happen to use Nutanix or you're just curious to see the product develop. Maybe you've got your eye on Nutanix Era because you're a database person and you're really interested in seeing, you know, a certain feature of Nutanix Era come out, or maybe you're handling VDI and you're thinking about Frame and you want to see the updates to that product. So Jake's kind of put this together as a quick way to access the different products within Nutanix and the ability to kind of see that development path. So didn't really have any major new updates for Nutanix, but did want to call this out because I don't know that this is necessarily something that people see a lot of in terms of when they research Nutanix. So I believe that's Jake's Twitter. I sent him a message on LinkedIn yesterday asking if I could throw that up here. So Jake, appreciate it. And yeah, for those of you that do have Nutanix or just are interested in kind of keeping an eye on it, this is a great resource. Mike, anything new kind of from your side or anything worth calling out?
No, Dan, I'll say this is the actual first time I've seen this. So pretty cool to see. You know, yeah. Usually I'm out at the Nutanix portal going through all the software releases and trying to comb through all this stuff. Puts it in a nice digestible format, you know, kind of similar to that Nutanix Bible that we talked about a couple weeks ago, from kind of putting the information out there that Nutanix does. This is a nice little nugget here. I'll make sure to bookmark this and add it to some of my newsletters that I send out.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, I think Jake is UK based, so probably not wanting to sit in at 9 a.m. East Coast time and watch this webinar, but I'll sure let him know that it was news to you. And yeah,
that's great. That's
very good stuff. Awesome. So that's like I said, that's kind of it for Nutanix news. .next, their major conference. It's online this year. It's coming up in September. So if you have questions on that, throw it in there. But let's kind of dig into the questions now. Had a handful come in, and we also kind of took some liberties with a few of the questions and merged them into one, or just kind of condensed them so that we could kind of navigate the topics a little more streamlined here. So this one, I think we had a few questions right around Nutanix hardware, what that refresh looks like, and this will tie into some of the licensing that we talk about, right? And there's that whole, you know, is this a hardware offering tied to hardware type ordeal, or is this actually truly software? And how do I know what model I'm using right now? Because they are in a bit of a transition. Mike, talk about maybe pre-subscription licensing, perhaps what those refreshes would look like, and then maybe we can kind of segue into what it looks like today. The next question coming up is about subscription licensing, so we'll definitely cover it. But you know, in terms of, hey, I bought a Nutanix cluster 5-6 years ago, is that an all-in kind of deal, or what's that typically look like?
Yeah, so as Nutanix has done their shift, as you said, over to software subscription and being more, let's call it software focused, you know, the licensing used to be, you know, I'd either buy life of device or node-based licensing, right? So if I bought 3 or 5 or 10 or 100 nodes, the licenses were all tied to those specific nodes. So as I go through a refresh, you know, I would look at, you know, what nodes do I need to refresh? How many do I need to refresh out of my environment? Do I need, you know, more often than not, you're never really refreshing the entire environment, right? I can do a systematic approach, which is the beauty of Nutanix and the process of refreshes. But each of those licenses was kind of tied to that node that it came from. So, if I bought 3 nodes, I've kind of got 3 life of device licenses applied to those. So when I bought my 4th node, I'd have to buy a 4th life of device license or a node-based license, 5th and 6th and so forth. But when the rub got to when I had my first 3 and I was going to start to refresh those, and I bought my 4th, 5th, and 6th to replace my first 3, I'm kind of rebuying to some extent that life of device or node-based license to go back and refresh the other one. So again, as where we see kind of in some licensing structures where you buy licensing based on sockets and you can mix and match, as you pull in and pull out, you might gain some benefits of it. The life of device or node-based license was not really flexible to replacing devices. So I would replace a Nutanix node. I'm buying a node, and basically the original node kind of went away from the licensing perspective. So, as they move towards that subscription model, they move towards more of a capacity-based model. It allowed people to get very flexible, and I know I'm jumping ahead to the next slide, as you said, to get very flexible with how they procured the nodes and then applied licensing to those nodes, because now it kind of floated across multiple sites. I could buy kind of a pooled licensing concept. I could buy a number of licenses and apply it to multiple sites versus having that license tied to every single node.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's I'm thinking of right. So for customers, G4, G5, that's the processor, how they kind of refer to the different nodes. Yeah. I'm thinking back to some of these Nutanix customers that have had it for a number of years, right? Some of the early adopters, and as you kind of walk through this, it reminds me of, hey, we've got the G4 is coming up. They talk in terms of like we've got kind of these different phases of how we expanded our infrastructure, and they're able to rip out the G4s, add in the G7s, and kind of do it in stages. So it sounds like it's pretty similar to like, hey, I want to expand the cluster in a sense, minimal downtime. You just kind of swap it out. But with the old exactly model, right. the licensing maybe is maybe something to think about, and we can dig into that for sure.
Yeah, the licensing was more of I'd call it an annoyance, right? I bought this license for this node. Well, I'm not increasing my nodes, right? I bought a node to replace my original node, but I still had to buy the license for that new node all over again, even though I bought the license for the original node. So that was the way it used to be, right? But you're spot on with kind of doing a refresh. It is the expansion concept, right? I mean, as we've got a lot of customers now, the G4s are pretty much gone, right? I can't think of any customers come across recently with G4s, but we've got a lot of G5s left, right? G5s are rolling off of support next year in 2022, right? So we're starting to see customers with G5s starting to look. So we've got G5s in the field, G6, G7, and G8s are rolling out here in a couple months, right? So we've got 4 generations of hardware potentially that customers are going to start to have to do refreshes with. And the way I kind of look at this to some extent, it's kind of like that iPhone concept, right? Last year an iPhone came out, this year an iPhone comes out, next year an iPhone comes out, and so forth. But you don't necessarily go to each iPhone, right? You don't upgrade every single year. You wait a couple of years. The biggest difference here is the fact that when I get a new iPhone, I've got to take everything off my old iPhone and transfer it, right? With Nutanix and that refresh model, the concept there is I buy a new node, I put it into my cluster, I expand the cluster just like I would do in normal cluster operations and expansion, but then I can go back and decommission one of my earlier nodes. So if we compare this to a 3-tier or even just a physical world, right? When I do a refresh on a storage array or when I do a refresh on my servers, I've got to buy brand new and migrate, right? And I've got to take everything off of one storage array potentially to another. I mean, the only one I can think of that's doing this at a really good level is probably Pure Storage with their controller swaps, where you don't rebuy storage, but a lot of times, I'm rebuying my storage. I'm rebuying that array. But with Nutanix, when I can, and this is a conversation I have with a lot of customers that don't want to spend a lot of money and don't want to have a big capital purchase, is buy 3 nodes. After 3 or 5 years, whatever your refresh cycle is, buy your 4th node and replace the first node. And then the next year you buy your 5th node and replace the 2nd node. And the third year after that, you buy the 6th node, you replace the 3rd node. So you're constantly replacing one node kind of every budget cycle, which extends the cluster and then shrinks the cluster. It extends the cluster and shrinks the cluster. So it allows you to basically buy exactly what you need when you need it, and refresh only what you need at that point in time. So it gives you a much better systematic approach for refreshing your hardware. The one thing about hardware, though, is, once you're in with a specific hardware vendor, and I think this is kind of a key point to take away. If I start with the NX line, I can increase and decrease. I can refresh my nodes, put one in, take one out as needed. But what I can't do is go across hardware vendors. So if I'm an NX shop today, and we've touched on this in previous webinars, I know I can't say I'm gonna go to HPE now because we're shifting internally from what servers we buy. I can't add an HPE node into that NX cluster and have it work. Now I'm all of a sudden going to a new cluster, which could be another refresh, right? I mean, you could do a refresh kind of in parallel that way. But the refresh process is extremely simple. Expand the cluster and then go ahead and decommission your earlier nodes.
That's good stuff. I know you said it's not possible, but could you imagine how much fun it would be to have a cluster with Dell and Cisco or HPE equipment and do a support call with that?
From what I've always heard is there's no technical reason as to why, there's nothing, again, this is software based, right? So there's no technical reason why we couldn't theoretically have multiple hardware vendors. Yeah, I mean, I could see, you start with an NX, you buy an HPE, you get a Dell, you get a Cisco, you get a Lenovo, you get a Class, you get Inspur. I'd love to see somebody's environment that has one model of every single vendor that Nutanix supports in a single cluster. That's like I don't know. I think there's been a movie about that. I don't really know what it was, but it feels like there'd be a movie about that type of scenario. But I mean, it's the point is, your refreshes become either really simple or very simple, right? And that's the way to look at the whole Nutanix concept from a refresh perspective is hardware is just there. We swap it in, we swap it out, no problem. The data moves around as needed, and everything's kind of non-disruptive, and everybody stays happy.
Yeah, good stuff. Really, we can kind of toss this question back at whoever submitted it and say, what do you want it to look like, right? Mm-hmm. and kind of build that roadmap out of, all right, do we make that big investment now and just, hey, we'll refresh and probably expand in 5 years? That's totally acceptable, right? But if you want to get a little more granular, especially, with the CFO and with the accounting team, hey, we want to strategically acquire this amount of resource over the next 6 months, and then we're going to add X amount over the following 6 months. I mean, you can really kind of map out multiple nodes over the course of 3 to 5 years and have a much more strategic spend, if you will.
Exactly, and that's in one of the kind of it's a sidebar on that with what Nutanix has provided with Prism Central and the capacity runway capabilities, right? I can look at what my current workloads are today, right, on my 3 or 5 node cluster, whatever you've got, and say, hey, next year I'm going to do a refresh. But I'm also going to be adding, workloads or something like that. So with a capacity runway, I can now say, okay, here's the workloads I'm going to add. I'm going to add, 5 additional SQL servers and 10 other VMs for some new suite of applications we're bringing in. But what happens if I also, instead of adding a G6, if I add a G7, or if I take this current 1065 G7, and maybe instead of adding another one of those, I add an 8000 series G7. What does my cluster runway look like at that point in time? So, so I can expand my cluster, of course, to the refresh point. I can expand, I can refresh to different models and different generations over time. But from the software perspective, Nutanix also gives me the ability to say, what does this look like when I do a refresh? What does my cluster look like? And then maybe do I tweak it a little bit for either different hardware sizing, whether it's a compute heavy node or a storage heavy node? What does my cluster look like at that point in time? So you're not always bound to a refresh of the same type of nodes as you go through the life cycle of Nutanix. So over the course of let's say 10 years, right, which would be an awesome amount of time to have a Nutanix cluster in place. I might change from a 1000 series node to an 8000 series node to a 3000 series node over the course of that 10 years through my refresh based on how my workload changes and shifts, right? And the use case. So refresh I wouldn't even call it a refresh. It's just kind of I think you said it earlier. It's just an expansion of whatever I need from my workload or from my use case.
Yeah, no, good stuff. It's a pretty cool shift in mentality, I think, with my customers and being able to kind of pick and choose what you want to deal with and not have kind of the the forced
Yeah.
conversation every 3 to 5 years. So I think
it's a great story. I mean, especially with a lot of G5s. You know, a lot of people
Yeah.
coming off G5s. Do I, you know, I can't, I don't have a G6. Can I go right to a G7? Absolutely. Why don't you just wait
Yeah.
and go to a G8, right? I mean, it's not a linear progression of I've got to go node to node to node from a generation. I can go from a G5 to a G8, which really gives us what, 4 or 5 years difference in hardware generations, right? So it's a great opportunity for customers to take advantage of long life cycles on the hardware and software, and then being able to refresh as they need to.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely make sure you're updating that software too. I've seen a few where they've got the old nodes and the old software, and that's a different conversation. That's some software updates first. So this question I've heard in various forms, just kind of talking to groups and working with Nutanix, the move to subscription licensing. For those of you that haven't kind of seen that shift yet, I think they really kicked it off formally about a year and a half ago or so. Really kind of a big headline, I guess you will, for Nutanix, because it did kind of shift like how they saw revenue. It shifted stockholder perception. There was a lot of, I wouldn't call it turmoil, but a lot of chatter around this shift. But Nutanix has come out pretty well in terms of kind of the upward momentum and where the business is headed after about a year and a half of this ongoing kind of move to subscription licensing. The question, right? Hey, we don't need it. Why spend the money? Why convert? Honestly, converting over to subscription is not a big expense from what I've seen. It's typically kind of baked into renewals. But from like a technical perspective, Mike, are there any implications as to, you know, what if I don't plan on new hardware, or you know, do I actually need to convert to subscription?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Dan, because, you know, and I would probably prefer to see subscription well, it is subscription license technically, right? But it's more capacity-based licensing, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we look at kind of how that licensing is done is I'm not buying a subscription. You know, the first thing I heard when I heard subscription license was, okay, so I bought a Nutanix node, I got a license for that node. Well, when subscription licensing came out, it was okay, am I now paying for the subscription on that one node every 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, right? And what happens again when that node dies and I have to buy a new one? So with capacity-based licensing and the structure there, yeah, if you're not going to be refreshing your hardware anytime soon, it's a tougher story to tell, or tougher kind of to kind of explain through. But the way I would look at this is, what happens if that node dies, right? And you need to buy another one, right? So your licensing structure is a little wonky at that point in time. But what happens if you're gonna say, if you've got a big cluster and you want to be able to go from, say, 10 nodes in one site to 5 and 5, right? Being able to kind of split them out and around. The subscription licensing or capacity-based licensing gives you the flexibility of moving as things change. To your original question, if I'm not changing anything in the next 3 to 5 years, I bought my 3 nodes. We're kind of a static environment, static shop. We don't do a lot of stuff. Moving to a subscription licensing, probably not going to get you much of anything, right? But where it comes into play is when you go buy that 4th node, you start to do your refreshes and things change, right? So I like the idea. I prefer the idea of capacity-based licensing, the subscription model, because now I get the flexibility of I could pre-buy to some extent some licensing and then fit into it as needed, right? I could I could buy X number of cores and X amount of flash for an environment, and mix and match. So if I in my scenario that I had 10 nodes and I was on subscription licensing, but I wanted to go 5 and 5, I could just split my capacity licensing out from from 10 total to 5 and 5. So it's definitely a delicate conversation to have for somebody who's not moving forward that much. But the thing to know is it's difficult to have node-based licensing and capacity-based licensing in the same cluster. It's not nice. It doesn't play well together, right? So a lot of times, if you are going to stick with this node-based licensing and go to capacity-based licensing because you buying a new node, well, there's a give and take there. You're going to have to flip at some point in time. But again, if you're static and never doing anything, fine. But again, if I'm a customer that is I bought my life of device nodes today and I'm getting ready to refresh, just know that that type of licensing structure is changing. You're now going to pay, your licensing is now going to be based on the amount of cores and flash within the cluster. So you do get some advantages moving to a subscription model like that, where, as we see hardware get more efficient, you're not having to necessarily rebuy capacity. You're not having to necessarily rebuy node licensing. So a good scenario I think here is, if I bought on subscription type licensing, bought a 3-node cluster that had, a total of 48 cores and 6 terabytes of flash. Well, when I go to refresh that hardware now, I'm not rebuying anything with licensing as long as I fit within my core and flash structure. But if I say buy a new node that has a couple more cores and a couple more terabytes of flash, then I'm only paying the difference to go from what I currently had up to the additive piece that I've got with my new node. So it gives you a much more flexible way to buy and utilize capacity as well. The other thing that we're starting to see now as well is folks that are looking at going to Nutanix clusters in AWS or in the near future Azure. That portability for licensing falls over there as well. So if I currently own, say, a subscription licensing for a DR environment that's a little bit legacy, maybe it's a G6, I'm going to scrap that and go to clusters in AWS. That licensing from my on-prem cluster is now portable to my AWS cluster. So again, you get some flexibility of moving around as needed that I think is going to be a great benefit for customers. But if you're a customer that's not going to move and you're a node-based license or a life of device type license, I'd be hard pressed to push towards moving to subscription licensing if you're not going to be doing anything for a while. Yeah. I think the Nutanix folks might feel different, but
yeah, it definitely makes sense. I think in particular your comment on cloud, right? Being able to have that platform that can quickly shift you over from on-premises to cloud. Like if you think that, hey, maybe we're ditching on-premises and we're going to jump into a public cloud environment, I mean, that should be part of that consideration, right? Like, do I want to continue to leverage the Nutanix platform? I think there's a ton of benefits to that. So being able to actually take what you invested in earlier and continue that and have that as that management tool, I think it gives you a lot of flexibility. So to your point, that's a great use case. But if you are, honestly, if you're staying on-prem, other than maybe like the existing kind of legacy licensing model going end of life, because at some point, right, we're going to see that where they're just going to move, accounting or what have you is really just, hey, this is the way that it needs to be done. Totally get it, right? Like that might be when you make that move. So no, good question, and definitely, take some time to think about your longer term plans if you are looking at the subscription licensing. If you're new to Nutanix, I mean, this is the way to go. Kind of what they offer out of the gate. The legacy licensing from our perspective, I think, just sometimes you are kind of getting into the, hey, what are your assets? What are the node serial numbers? That kind of thing, right? So it's just a cleaner experience overall. It makes it easier to predict yearly expenses when you kind of know what that software line item is going to be. It's not directly tied to hardware anymore. So any questions there, it's certainly worth digging into, and even licensing in the different tiers that you have. I mean, that in its own right is a conversation. But if you have any questions on kind of that subscription model, feel free to throw them in there. But hopefully that clears that up.
Yeah, Dan, one point on that is from a budgeting perspective. The other thing I like about the capacity and subscription licensing is now I know, hardware just kind of becomes the hardware, right? So when you see your quote from Nutanix, the hardware is the hardware, but the licensing structure now is since it's broken down for cores and flash, I now know what my cost is, right? I can look and be in budget. So if I'm going to add another node, I can see exactly what my hardware costs are probably going to be, but I also know what the licensing structure and licensing cost is going to be if I add 4, 6, 8 CPUs and a couple terabytes of flash, because I can now break that down to see exactly what that costs. So from a consumer perspective, it does remove a little bit of the behind the curtain pricing that you used to get. It's like, okay, I bought 3 nodes. I have really no clue what kind of that per node price was, or to be able to break down and then see what my costs would be if I added a 4th node, right? So it gives you a very predictable structure now, I think, for being able to see what my costs for CPUs, and if I add X amount of resources, what my costs are probably going to be, right? And of course, anytime we're talking about this, it's flexible. And I think you've got a slide coming up on that.
Yeah, so we'll jump into that for sure. Because we are at 9:30, for those of you that might have to drop, I did want to just leave the info here. So kind of, if you need more info, right, Leanne, who you see kind of down there smiling in the bottom left, she will be following up with just some additional info, specifically on our technology portfolio optimization assessment. I had to practice saying that a few times before I was able to get that out cleanly, but it's the TPOA. And what we do with this is really take a baseline of what you're doing today. If you're not in the Nutanix shop, typically Nutanix is what we incorporate into our vision around consolidation of on-premises and building out that hybrid cloud strategy. And so the optimization assessment is where we ingest a lot of the data that you've got around your infrastructure, your expenses, what you're doing from an infrastructure perspective, categorize all that, collect it, analyze it, and then build out a roadmap for identified areas of optimization. And that may or may not involve Nutanix, right? But a big piece of that, if there is going to be an on-premises footprint, will in fact incorporate some sort of consolidation of effort on the infrastructure that exists on premises. So Leanne will be following up with some info on that. Also following up with the webinar recording and info to find the next few events here. So for those of you that do have to drop, thank you again. We're going to hop back into our final question here before we wrap. But again, thanks to those that were able to attend, and we'll hopefully see you next time. So back to kind of this final question, and this shouldn't be too much to kind of dig into because I think we've kind of covered this one a bit. But in terms of, all right, I know what my hardware should be roughly. How do I decide between Dell or Cisco or HPE or SuperMicro? They're all saying they're the best. They're all sending me their info. Like how do I figure out kind of the best platform for me for Nutanix?
Interesting question, and I'd probably ask from the sales side as well. How do you go about battling for this, right, from the customer perspective? But the beauty of Nutanix, and we've touched on it in previous Nutanix at 9 sessions, was you get the freedom of choice, right? If you're today, you're if you're an NX shop, and I mentioned this earlier, and you want to move to HPE, right? You can't. There's nothing keeping you from doing that, right? So being able to kind of pick and choose the hardware you're running on, really your only limitation is going to be you just can't mix and match in the same cluster. That's really the only limitation out there. And what's supported, and what's actually supported on the from Nutanix. Again, I can't go out and buy a couple off the brand server vendors that nobody's ever heard of and expect to run that on Nutanix. But there's such a wide gamut. I mean, if we were to pull up the graphic of what hardware vendors are supported out there, it's massive, right?
Yeah.
Either through OEM or third party. So, when I look at this question, one of is, as a customer, how do I get the best deal for the hardware supporting Nutanix? And I would probably look at this question and kind of reverse it from an answer perspective and say, what do you actually need, right?
Yep.
So you're going into Nutanix. Again, if you tell me here's your current workloads and that maybe you're going to grow 10% or 15% year over year for the next couple of years, or you tell me here's my workloads and I'm about to deploy a massive amount of stuff. I'm going to deploy 5,000 seats of VDI. Well, that goes in and that's going to flex your hardware choice quite a bit, right? So there's no reason I couldn't say go with a small compute cluster for my primary workloads and a VDI cluster for something else. But it allows you to very tightly narrow in your focus on what hardware you need for deployment versus saying, well, I think over the next couple of years I'm gonna do this. So let me just go ahead and buy 30 nodes now, and maybe I'll grow into it in a couple of years. I've got the money now, so I'm gonna go ahead and buy it now. Which is valid, right? If you're kind of organization that you get money every couple of years and you've got to spend it, whether you want to or not, sure, you can do that. But the point of Nutanix allows you to come in and say, hey, here's what I need now, and then they just go ahead and bump my hardware up over the next couple of years. At that point in time, you're able to, I think, leverage kind of some of the Nutanix benefits of the capacity-based licensing instead of buying a lot of licensing up front and then having to hopefully someday use it, right? Which is a big kind of consumer of cost as well, is to be able to say, okay, I'm only going to buy 3 nodes now. I can only do my licensing for 3 nodes. Maybe I add a 4th and 5th and so forth, but I'm only buying then what I need. So I think at that point in time, how do I negotiate the best deal for hardware supporting Nutanix is to really utilize Nutanix and the benefits they provide of being able to shrink what you might need to buy to fit what you need rather than buying a lot of extra at the time, which I think saves, again, if I was to come and say, just use the wife kind of explanation, right? If I'm going to tell my wife I'm going to go out and buy something and it's this massive grill, well, she's going to say, why do I need a new grill when we can get a smaller grill that's going to hold us over for a couple of years, right? So maybe a bad scenario, right? I use that because I just got a new grill, so that was a tense operation there. But it's I think, how do I negotiate the best deal for hardware supporting Nutanix? It's to really have Nutanix and your partner, somebody like Egroup, help you define what you need now and what you're going to need in a couple of years as you grow into it, to allow you to have a very predictable cost structure as you go through it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll kind of jump back to the final slide here, just because I think we do address this a lot, right? Like, obviously, hardware, whether it's, the hardware by the public cloud provider, which you don't think about, right? But hardware is a component of that. It's what's running that public cloud data center. Or what you pick on premises. I think, to kind of summarize today, right? Nutanix is a hardware, software. Nutanix is a software, and the benefits that you're going to look for on premises and in the cloud are entirely software driven. So when it comes to actually negotiating that hardware, you can kind of get it involved. I've always told people, if you don't mind, start with just Nutanix and their SuperMicro appliance. And at the end, right, if you've really got a hankering for some Dell, or you're on a state contract that only does HPE, let's kind of discuss the hardware at the end, right? It's kind of like buying a car, and the hardware is the tires, right? Like, maybe at the end they're like, well, do you want winter tires or summer or all weather? It's kind of one of those final thoughts that doesn't really make a big impact. Maybe you've got a specific use case. All right, I need my winter tires, but at the end of the day, it's really that what's in the engine, right? Like, what's Nutanix doing? So if you can manage it, hold off on the hardware providers. Don't loop them in if you can. Even towards the end, when it comes to Nutanix, they all have their own competing solutions. So I imagine they'll be in your purview anyways. But I would definitely keep Nutanix as a software only, and treat it as such, and then just think of a hardware selection as kind of like a finishing touch, right? Like how am I going to get this thing on the street? So with that being said, I'm just going to double check the questions. I think we had a kind of quiet crowd today. Hopefully you all weren't G4 users scared into realizing that G4 is pretty much dead, as Mike said about 30 minutes ago. We can certainly help with that, but it looks like we are good as I wait for the Q&A to kind of spin and load. But if you have any questions, like I said, we're good. No new questions today. So looks like, Mike, we did it again. We answered everything and knew everybody's thoughts ahead of time. So congratulations on that. We'll be doing another one of these, and we'll have a new kind of schedule up through the end of September, I believe, coming out soon with the different topics. We'll be getting back into database, getting back into security, talking about updates around just overall management with Nutanix. So keep checking these out. Like I said, Leanne, who will be reaching out, she'll have some more info on this session, on our optimization assessment for the technology portfolio. And if you have any questions, she can point you in the right direction. And we thank you again for your time and look forward to talking to you down the road. Thanks again, Mike.
Absolutely, Dan. Always a pleasure.
See you.